In the last lecture, we were talking about the sexual revolution, introduced the idea of the sexual revolution and the questioning of traditional morals when it comes to marriage and sex in general. But the primary target will be marriage. And should we restrict ourselves to just sex inside marriage? And recall what we've talked about before, that marriage used to not be seen as primarily about the spouses, about the people getting married, but about the children, for their protection and for their nurturing. And how well children are nurtured, how well they're raised and socialized, treated to, to treat other people with respect and to be responsible, how well children are nurtured will impact society, right? Will those kids, when they are grown up, will they contribute to society or will they hurt others and tear down society? Remember what Hannah Arendt said, every generation we have a barbarian invasion. It's the new set of kids. And now how are we going to socialize them? Will they be contributing members of society? Remember what the founders, what they believed, not just liberty, but ordered liberty. And if we're going to restrain, if we're going to have freedom, we need to limit the government. If we're going to limit the government, we need some other institutions that will encourage order. And they believed religion and family were key to this. Why the family? After all, great thinkers in the past have suggested we replace the family, maybe replace it with government. Remember, Plato suggested that for the elite, we would have the children raised in common by, I guess you would call it, government. But would a bureaucrat do as good a job as a parent? Right? Why parents? Because they love you. Right? Would a bureaucrat die for you? Would a government worker stay up till 2 a.m. wondering where you've been and nag you about your homework? Don't think so. Remember the heart transplant test. Would a government worker do a heart transplant? Remember, there's really no such thing with live people because you die if you have a heart transplant. Parents would do that. If that were a thing, parents would do that for their children. Nobody else would do that. And so if we're going to build society, we've got to find some way of getting people to care about other people and to care about people who at that time can't contribute. Children can't bring any material benefit to the people who are caring for them. At that time, it's just a one-way street. And whom do we trust to do that? They're not going to do it perfectly in this fallen world, but it has been parents. And so the idea of marriage has been, if two people are going to have sex, we're going to allow it only in an institution where these two people will be bonded together. And we know now that when two people have sex, there are chemicals released in their brains. This is part of the reason we'll talk about why um, many are arguing that there is depression among people, especially women who are having sex before marriage. Especially for women, when two people have sex, there are chemicals released in their brain that make them want to bond with the other person. Um, and so, what we do with marriage is to say, okay, because sex can create a human, we're going to make sure that it also creates a lasting family. We're going to reinforce those bonds that are created in part at least by the chemistry, and all of society is going to come around you and say, we want this to succeed. We're behind you. That's what marriage ceremonies are for, to say, we support you and we need you. We need you to succeed. Because if you succeed, your children will contribute to our future. If they don't, your children will cause us problems. So that's why society has long said we have an interest in what you do sexually. So we're going to ask now. That was the argument about what, that is why, for those who thought it through, a lot of people just, well, we just think that's how you ought to do it. You just should wait till you're married. But the people who thought it through, why did they believe that we need family? It was because marriage and family, so that we could make sure children are taken care of. And they believed if we get rid of the family, children and society will suffer. So has their prediction come true? Let's look at some statistics that are now um, becoming just harder and harder to evade. And this is something that is not for one political party. This is something that is across the spectrum. People are starting to raise and become aware of. President Obama, um, not by any means a Republican conservative, would talk about the need for fathers. And when we talk about fathers, it's pretty much marriage, because generally we we're going to generally see moms be around for the kids. And so when we talk about single parents, almost universally, there are exceptions, almost universally it's single moms. The question is, will the dads be there? And so more and more we're talking now about the impact that has on children's lives and when they're adults, when the dads aren't there. And just one statistic, I'll start before we look at these graphs, is never forget the person most likely to be raped in America is a little girl or boy raped by their mom's boyfriend, who just happens to be in the house at that time. And the safest person, feminists will talk a lot about men who abuse their wives. That does happen, right? But actually, statistics show the woman who is safest is a woman who is in a marriage with one man and stays in that marriage. Okay, lesbian relationships, lesbian marriages even, far more likely to abuse each other. Women with boyfriends, more likely to be abused. Not the story you usually get on TV. So um, let's look now at some charts that talk about the impact of different family structures. So here we have the first one I want to look at, measuring children in poverty by family structure. Really no comparison. Look at first marriage, one marriage, man and woman get married, they have a kid, they stay married. Compare that with never married, a single mom, basically. Now, we have to be very careful throughout all these conversations. We are not attacking individuals. Probably all of us have a loved one who is a single mom, and we care a lot about her. And there are single moms out there who are super moms, who are superhuman, and sacrifice for their kids, and their kids turn out great. Um, and we love them. And I actually think the church needs to do more for single moms. I think we need to get more involved in their lives and reach out and see how we can help the kids. But we are not here talking about individuals. Whenever you talk about society, you talk about history, you talk about the whole society, you have to talk statistics. Statistically, okay, single moms are much more likely to be in poverty, and their kids will also be in poverty. A frustrating thing that Theodore Dalrymple, not a Christian, an atheist, okay, he's an atheist, but he is one of the best. Some of the people who are the best about talking about the sexual revolution are actually atheists. Theodore Dalrymple, Heather McDonald, maybe they're just not as concerned about hurting people's feelings as Christians are, but um, as he talks about it, it's frustrating because the people who gave us the sexual revolution said, well, we need to be able to just end marriage whenever or have sex however we want, were the elites who wanted to be able to experiment. Well, they found out in the 60s and 70s that it was hurting, and now they're actually the ones who get married more often than anybody else. The problem is now that they mock the idea of the Victorians, where the elites have to worry about how they act because they don't want to be bad examples for the poor, and we don't want to be Victorian. Well, the Victorians actually had a point that um, when the elites question and challenge and undermine traditional sexual mores, the lower classes pick up on it, and now you have lower classes who, for many of them, just never get married. It's not even a thing in their world. You're not going to see some woman with a PhD from Harvard having a baby without getting married. So, as some commentators will say, it's time the elite start to preach what they practice. They're getting married and staying married. They might have sex outside of marriage, but they're not having babies outside of marriage. Um, but they need to start telling other people how important that is. But is that the message you're getting in Hollywood movies? I don't think so. And so um, we are worried about the wealth gap, the growing gap between the rich and the poor. Even though the poor are better off than they used to be, the rich are getting better off even faster. I would argue one of the main reasons that happens is there's also, to a great extent, the, the wealth gap mirrors the marriage gap. We see here an example of um, kids grown up without a father in the house, and when there's especially single moms, are much more likely to be in poverty. So what do we do about poverty? I would argue the poor need marriage much more than they need laws from smart people. Remember, can we legislate utopia? Just let you take a quick look at this graph. Compare the kids' time in poverty by family structure. Okay, similar statistics here. Okay, now last unit we talked about the civil rights movement, and here we're not going to get into any more details about um, when we talked about institutional racism and the how blacks are more likely to be in poverty and why that's the case. Where there could be many different reasons for that. Um, but it seems like one big concern right here seems to be marriage. Just look at this statistic. This is among blacks, children in poverty by parents' marital status. Okay, those who are kids whose parents are married and they're black, they're only 3% of them are in poverty. Um, but those not married that are in poverty is 27%. Just a huge difference. And so, for example, um, we need to be careful about this. The at the time head of the NAACP, remember they're the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. That's the institution that funded the fight against school segregation and led to the 1954 decision desegregating schools. At the time, I think it was 1990s, Kwaize Mfume, he said, yeah, there are two problems. The blacks do face racism, but they also have a big hurdle they got to overcome is lack of families and fathers. But he said the problem is when we bring that up, then whites don't want to talk about racism too. Well, we won't talk about the issue of racism. We've addressed that outside. We'll leave that as a separate controversy. Let's just say here, again, across the spectrum, we're seeing people recognize that we need fathers. Children need fathers. Um, okay, similar trend. Average annual income of families with children under 18 by family structure. Again, what do you see on the two ends of the spectrum? Single moms, never married, and first marriage. Just completely different realms. The wealth gap, to a great extent, is the marriage gap. Again, remember what I said, I believe the Bible, Christians should be doing more to help single moms. Look who's right next to never married, is widowed. The church has a responsibility given by God to look out for widows and orphans. And I think single moms are right there. We need to be doing more to see what we can do to help them. Okay, another helpful one, but we're not going to spend much time on that one. Let's move. Okay, income quintile. This is, are you in the top 20% of the society, the bottom 20% as far as income? This can be a little misleading because, as Thomas Sowell will point out, people don't stay in the same quintile. Many people start in poverty, move up to the middle class, some even go up to the top. Still pretty telling though. Okay, the bottom 20%, right? Families with children by income quintile and family structure, 73.6% of those families are in the bottom 20%. Less than 5% in the top. Husband and wife, exact opposite. Okay, so actually, I guess the way I should have been describing that. If you go to the top quintile, I didn't put that correctly first. If you go to the top quintile, 95% of the people in the top quintile, the top 20% richest Americans, 95.1% of them are intact families, right? Now, From these elites, though, are you going to hear them saying marriage is important? Get and stay married. Very unlikely. And again, that's why there are commentators who are upset and saying, you need to start preaching what you practice because it's working for you. Less than 5% of the children whose parents are in the top 20%, less than 5% are in single parent families. Go to the other end, the bottom 20%, the vast majority are single parents. It's just, again, we need to do more to help single moms. It's hard being a parent with two parents all by yourself when you have to raise the kids and go to work. Hard to know how they even do it. Great challenge. And there's all these other ways that it lowers your income. You've only got one paycheck. Um, but that's not. There's just many multiple ways that reinforce each other of putting people who are single parents in the lowest of income earners. Okay, we also need to, we've talked about single moms. We also need to talk about divorce. Again, here we are not singling out people. We are not here to hate on people. We're not talking about individuals. Like I said, we all have loved ones who've been divorced. Some of the most wonderful people I know have been divorced. We are not, when it comes to what you think about divorce, I will leave that up to you and your church, to what they teach about it. Here we have to talk statistics. And even when it comes to divorce, uh, I think, we need to be loving for people who've gone through divorces. No one saying, oh, that was a wonderful experience. There have been some studies that show that going through divorce for many people is more painful than it is to lose a loved one, for to have a loved one die. So it's very difficult. My concern is statistics and what message our culture tells people. What does it tell people about divorce? I would argue it is far too frivolous about divorce. When you're going down 285 and you see a billboard that makes it seem flippant and no big deal, a billboard that just says for a divorce lawyer, undo I do. When people have divorce parties, when they were throwing their engagement rings into a mock toilet. Not that that's happening all the time, but in general, I just wonder if our society really speaks about how painful and difficult divorces really are. Okay, just one statistic. Financially, it's very difficult to go through a divorce. Now you're going to have two houses instead of one. You're going to have extra cars. You're doubling so many of the bills. And so many of the synergies you have with two people working together are gone now. This is another cause of poverty. Again, not telling you whether people should have divorces or not. I'm not getting into that. That's up to you and your church. I'm just talking statistics, statistics that we often don't talk about. That there will often be a drop in income, a drop greater than that experienced by Americans during the Great Depression. And people, uh, if they're going to have a divorce, they should at least know um, what they're getting into and what challenges they might face. Okay, how much is a family worth? How much wealth does a family have? The average family, just read this. Look at the first and last bars. Single mom, first marriage. So it's not 3,500, it's $350. That's how much wealth they have to their name. Versus first marriage family, the average is over $220,000 wealth. Not how much you earn, but how much wealth you keep. Again, to a great extent, you see it here in this chart. The wealth gap is the marriage gap. When the people in the 1950s and 60s were arguing for the sexual revolution, there were arguments against it, but we didn't have the statistics to back it up yet and as much. And now we've got it. The verdict is in. Destruction of marriage is going to impact children. Notice percentage of unemployed mothers in poverty, if mother remains single, 100%. Percent of mothers and children who are poor. Um, This chart illustrates that should these parents marry each other, so this is talking about out of wedlock births and the parents of these newborns. If two people have sex, they have a baby, if they get married, when the conditions are correct, they're interested in marriage, the father has a steady, not necessarily even a middle income job, just a steady job. The father's not abusive. That's not okay. We're not saying be an abusive relationship where the guy beats you. No. But just we're not requiring that he be super rich or anything, though. Just he doesn't beat the wife. He's got a steady job, doesn't have to be middle income. He's not addicted to drugs. Okay? Just a bottom minimum requirements. If they get married, poverty will drop dramatically. Okay? So from 100% down to 35%. Marriage makes a difference. People say, well, if it's it's just a piece of paper, it makes a difference. Again, let's look at the statistics. Again, you think about, remember when we talked about Margaret Mead and Alfred Kinsey and Dr. Money, and they had this error of science about them, and which has really been challenged. But we look at the science now. Look at the statistics. The statistics are really on the side of marriage. Okay, here I think this might be helpful for thinking of the ideology that I think many colleges have um, encouraged in women. And again, it's not just in women, but look at TV, right? If you have a father in a TV show, what's he going to be like? Like if it's a comedy, who's the smart person, right? No, the the dad is often the Homer Simpson, right? Um, this is probability. So we said if the mom has a baby, if they get married, poverty is much less likely. But will that unwed mother marry the father? If she has a general distrust of men, it's much less likely. So the probability a single mom will marry the father of her child is most influenced by the following factors. Just read the notes at the bottom. First, the father's subordinateness of the mother. Well, I guess you can read these yourself. The first of these three factors, the father's subordinateness, the mother, is 17 times more powerful than the last, the father's income prospects. We hear a lot of people talking about, well, there's no marriageable man, they're not making enough money. That's the least important, according to statistics. The mother's distrust of men in general, most likely formed by the experience of her own father, is powerful in blocking movement toward marriage. So, yeah, I talked about ideology. Maybe that's not the main thing. I do think it's an important message to men, right? If you get married, have kids, what impact you could have on your own kids, you are giving them the model of what it is to be a dad. And this is something that's hard to break. It's hard to break this a chain. If a girl is abused, will she then distrust men and then not get married, and then her kids will be impacted. Okay, we talked about slightly mentioned the loneliness we're having in our society. We have a loneliness epidemic, and depression and suicide have gone up in our society. We even had a couple of years there where we actually had some demographics who their lifespan was actually decreasing. White males, their lifespan was actually going down, something we've never seen before in America that I'm aware of. Um, and as important as that is, happiness, the percent of people who describe themselves as happy by marital status, um, double what it is for people who aren't married. And that is not, again, think of the messages you get. How many songs do you have about how wonderful it is to get married versus how many songs to, well, I'm, told him to get out of here and I'm on my own. I can do whatever I want now. In general, married people are happier. Again, there are exceptions. It's a generalization, but when you're talking about a whole society, you have to make generalizations. Okay, measuring by family structure. And just to make sure you know what I'm talking about, cohabiting means a man and a woman are they're living together, but they're not married. Okay. So remember, this is for the kids' own good. Kids who are in a family where the parents are married, right, are half as likely to have emotional disorders as kids with a single parent who is um, divorced, widowed, or separated. Then, and of course, what is consistently on the lower side is married. Then, when it comes to conduct disorders, that is acting out. Now, think about the reverb. Remember, we talked. It's not just the kid, but it's the kid. It's society. Society has the traditional argument why we're interested in your sex life and your marriage is because if you have sex, you could create a kid, and how that kid is raised could impact the rest of us. So, acting out, conduct disorders, um, could that be doing crimes, impacting other people? Could it just be disrupting class, right? But still, that could have an impact. One thing I like to ask is um, what is the state, what is the place in America where there is the most upward mobility? Something we all love to think about. Conservatives, liberals, we all love this upward mobility. You start poor, you move up rich. The biggest movement from poor to rich. Anybody want to guess? It's Utah. Why Utah? Why is Utah the place where we see the most move from poor to rich? Now, this is something such a big, it's, I don't know that you could prove this, but it makes sense. Think about it. What do we see and what is Utah known for? Mormons. And what what is very important to Mormons? What do they make a really big deal about? Now, family. Again, we don't, of course, we know we should not make, and I'm not saying Mormons do, but there are people, they have got this idea people make a religion out of family. No, we shouldn't make a religion out of family. My religion is about Jesus. But um, there are some faiths that emphasize marriage as part of how you live out your faith and family. And the Mormons, to them, it's family's a really big deal. And because of that, some would argue um, kids are in an environment where they're much more likely to succeed, to learn, remember, to get socialized. They know how to behave, and so that studies have shown even if your child is in a single parent family household, if they're in a school where most of the kids have a mom and dad both in the house, then that kid will benefit. Think about it. If the parents, again, it is unbelievably hard to be a parent. I can't imagine doing it all by myself, right? And so you've been working all day. Now you all on your own. You have to make sure your child is disciplined. I know one single parent divorced who said, if I just had somebody to kind of share the burden, to where somebody else could be the bad guy a little. You're always on. You're always the one telling kids what to do. And kids need to be told what to do. No, you can't do that. You need to do your studying. You need to listen to your teacher. You need to not talk back. Um, again, kids need to be socialized. Who's going to do it? It's very hard doing it all by yourself. But if you live in a community where everybody else has two people working at it, think of what that classroom might look like. What we know, class management has one of the most important things that has an impact on how much kids are going to learn in that class. And so if there's order in the classroom, that kid is much more likely to learn more and be able to move up. And so again, this is what I'm trying to point out. The argument for marriage has been um, society has an interest in your sex life because if you have kids and they're brought up in a family, they're more likely to be contributing members of society who can then help society thrive. And I think we see just one example. So here's not only is it sad because it impacts the kid, but it impacts the culture around them. Okay, just see what trend you see here. This is one of the saddest charts I've read. Look at some of the footnotes. In Britain, the step family abuse levels are 6 times higher. The always single mother family 14 times higher, cohabiting family 20 times higher. Most dangerous family structure, mother cohabits with a boyfriend. 33 times higher. The, the person most likely to be beaten to death is a little boy or girl beaten to death by the mom's boyfriend, especially if there's several different boyfriends coming in at different times. Am I judging them? Am I thumping a Bible and say, evil sinner, y'all aren't married? I'm not talking about the Bible at all. I'm not judging anybody. I'm just giving statistics. If the boyfriend living in there is not the dad of that child, 33 times more likely to be physically abused. Similar, we will see statistics for rape. Now, has it ever happened that a father has raped his own child? Yes, it has happened, but it is statistically much, much, much less likely. As I said, the person most likely to be raped in America is a little boy or girl raped by their mom's boyfriend. It's just much less likely that a father will rape his own children. Of course, they're going to make movies about that because it is, well, they don't tell us why. My guess is because it undermines traditional ideas of sexuality that the establishment doesn't like. Or you could say because it sells tickets and gets people's attention. But it's not the norm. It's not the most likely incident when a child is abused. Already alluding to this. So what do we mean by fatal abuse? Beaten to death. This is why family matters. This chart right here is why family matters. And you say, oh, you're judging people. I'm not judging anybody. They could be much more loving people. They could be more caring people. As a Christian, I know I'm a wicked sinner. Just talking statistics. Comparative risk ratios for fatal abuse. A mom with a boyfriend in the house, the kid is 73 times more likely to be beaten to death. Babies beaten to death. Homicide rate for infants. Now, when did the sexual now again, something this big, can I prove it was the sexual revolution? I can't prove it. Correlation does not prove causation. Just two things, one happens and the other doesn't mean one proved the other, but they seem to fit. And at least you would think it would make people curious to say, should we do some investigating and to see there's a correlation, is there also causation? So when did the sexual revolution? They talked about it in the 50s and really talked about it in the 60s, but it really kicked in the 70s and 80s. And then started to have some pullback. Okay, divorces actually shrank after the 80s. Um, Although some would say it's just we're having fewer divorces because people just aren't getting married. So it's somewhat leveled off. Seems to me like there's a strong correlation, again, not necessarily causation yet. I'm going to do some research, but a strong correlation between the sexual revolution and babies, and I'm not talking about abortion here, babies who are already born getting killed. Looking at the footnotes, almost all infant homicides result from the mother's actions. This objective measure is a key barometer of serious dysfunction in that mother-child relationship. These charts just make you want to cry. So what, people say, we can, anything you want to say as a family is a family. Well, that's not what the statistics seem to suggest. Again, single moms, it keeps coming out. I'm not here to bash on single moms. I love some single moms very much. I would do anything for them. I try to help out their families. But as a society, statistically, what would we like to see encouraged? What seems to work? Chesterton's fence. Hey, marriage is oppressive. I can't do what I want. Let's get rid of it because I don't see what it's doing. We did, and then we found out what it was doing. marriage was protecting. Wasn't perfect, but this world isn't perfect. You're always going to have flaws. To a great extent, marriage was protecting the most vulnerable, children and babies. Percent of adolescents expelled by family structure. Again, this is so 1% for intact families versus 4 times as much for single moms. Again, there are superhuman single moms who go out of their way. I've seen it, and divorced families who just go out of their way to try to do everything for their kids. Statistically, I'm just talking statistics, it's a harder situation. So again, I think churches need to do more to try to help these types of families. But again, what I keep going back to is what message does our society send? Does our society send the message that marriage tends to make people more successful at doing what families have done, which is raise kids? Is that the message our intellectual elite are sending us? Is that what movies are about? Is that what TV shows, sitcoms are about? Again, we want kids to succeed. We want to see their GPA high. And if they learn a lot, they can be producing for society at large. They can come up with new ideas to solve our problems. So what do we see? Is there a noticeable difference between family type and GPA? Again, for a single mom, really hard. You've been working all day, and you may even have to work longer shifts because you're already in poverty. And then with whatever energy you've got to come in and try to make sure your kids are getting their homework done. Again, I'd like to see more places where churches are stepping in to help mentor, make sure the homework is getting done. Another fact that who was it brought this? Was it Thomas Sowell brought up? What happens when that male son gets bigger than the single mom, right? There's actual mother abuse going on in some. I'm not saying it's all over the place, but it does happen. And how is that mom when she's got a 225-pound son and she's 125 pounds? How's she going to make sure that he does everything he needs to and does his homework? It can happen, but it's just much easier for her if she's got the support of a husband. Okay, I think a lot of kids know how hard it is to be a parent, but they don't talk about it much. Maybe this could be an opportunity for us to thank our parents for all the effort they've put out to raise us and help make sure we are prepared to succeed in life. Again, we see both um, impacting the possibility of success for a child and how much they're going to impact society and comparing by family structure. Is this what the media is talking about? Is this what you're going to learn about in college? Will you hear this in college ever? Will you ever hear about this again? And one of the things you want, if you want your kids to be successful, you want them to get a good job, right? But to get a good job, what is so important is what we call social capital. Have you learned how to behave among other people, right? Have you learned how to be courteous, right? There are people who don't know how to get angry at somebody and not hit them, right? Because that's all they've seen. Um, have you been, if you are lying and you have a tendency to lie, are you going to be as reliable as your boss going to be likely to put you in charge of the money, right? Are you willing to, when your boss says something and your boss is wrong or rude, can you just suck it up and drive on, right? The customer is always right. If a customer is obnoxious, can you tell them off? No. Have you been taught this restraint? Much more likely to come from intact family. Kids who have this type of track record are less likely to be able to have the path towards success in the future. Again, which I think is a lot to do with the wealth gap. Incarceration uh, means going to jail. What again? Look at the different statistics. Again, this is not so it's only 3.7. So it's not saying like it's always going to happen for step families or single mom. It's always going to happen. It's just 1% versus 2.7, 3.7%. But what's almost uniformly the least likely is the raised intact married family. So, and by the way, you've got this all these slides, so hopefully you're going through this packet with me. Um, I'm going to make sure they're on RenWeb and you can access them as well. Let me make sure I make a note to myself to make sure I send that message out. Okay, so let's look at the fine print at the bottom. Women who have sexual relationships with men other than their future husbands, so this is premarital sex, are more likely to eventually divorce. Also, should they be cohabit, shacking up, living with somebody, having sex with them you're not married to, with someone other than their future husband, the probability they will divorce increases still more. Monogamy, only one sex partner in a lifetime, seems to be central to a stable marriage. Okay, and of course, we also know the way to make sure you don't get an STD is monogamy. One man, one woman, that's it. Okay, and we can actually tell how likely you are statistically to have a successful marriage, especially for women. It may sound politically incorrect, it may sound unfair, but it's not this. It does impact men too, but it impacts women more, has a bigger impact on women. We are able to tell statistically how likely you are to have a successful marriage or have your marriage fail based on one thing, how many people you had sex with before you got married. And it's not just, well, more than one, it's less likely. It's like with each additional partner, we can see how less likely your marriage is to succeed. And we also know some people, just talking about, so go ahead and look at these bars. Okay, percent increase in probability of divorce. So least likely to have divorce is not having sex at all. And believe it or not, but we were told with the sexual revolution, oh, we want to be free, we want to have good sex and enjoy sex, and oh, you Christians, you're just suppressed and backwards. And actually, studies have shown the people who report the greatest satisfaction in sex in their sex lives is people who don't have sex before they get married, and then once they get married, they only have sex with that spouse. They actually report the greatest satisfaction in sex, I believe. They report having it more often, and I believe it also increases if they are religious, which is the exact opposite of what we've been told. People have this idea Christians hate sex, it's a bad thing. No, that's not biblical at all. They just believe it's a gift from God, and the only way but it's a very powerful force, and so it should only be used in the way God intended it, which is inside marriage. I'm not pointing my finger and calling anybody a sinner or saying you're hateful, I'm better than you, or whatever. I'm just saying Christians have traditionally seen sex, it's like fire. Fire in the fireplace, it's good, provides a lot of benefits. Um, sex is a good thing, it's a gift from God. Fire gets on the carpet, now we got some problems. And marriage has been seen as the proper context for marriage, also for women in particular. Um, they tend to have a more satisfied sex life. Reportedly, this is just psychological data when they are felt cared about. And if the man has said, remember that book that I've talked about before that is so important by that Christian sociologist, and I think it was a Harvard University Press, maybe it was Oxford University Press, called Cheap Sex. And the reason he called that is it used to be, remember, social assumptions, the lenses we look at the world through, used to be it was assumed a guy would not ask a woman to have sex with him unless they were married. If a guy came up to a woman and said, "We have sex with me," she's like, maybe slap him. Like, of course not. What do you think? Right? The assumption was against that the guy would have to. So, what was the price for marriage? The price for marriage was, I'm going to live with you forever until I die. That was the price for marriage. Now it's cheap sex because the price. Excuse me. That was the price for sex. Was, I'm going to live with you forever. Okay, it was commitment was the price the man had to pay. Now it has become cheap because the price for sex may be just a couple drinks and some compliments. So um, let's talk real quickly about cohabitation, a man and a woman living together, having sex but not getting married. A lot of people would say, "Oh well, we should we want to make sure we're compatible first." Um, Actually, people who live together before they get married, their marriage is less likely to succeed than people who don't live together first. Now, why would that be? Now, let's think about that. We're going to watch a video in the sexual marketplace in a little while. Um, I'm not saying this is what people ought to be looking for or should be the main thing they're looking for. We're just talking about what the world is really like, not what we want it to be, but statistically, what is the world really like? So, what do men and women statistically tend to value? Some would say it's rooted in biology. Men statistically tend to value youth and beauty. What do women tend to value? Um, Stability and productive. How can he produce? Can he make enough money to support a family? They may not think about that way specifically in terms of a family, but statistically, that's, we could probably look at dating sites and gather these statistics that who tends to get chosen the most. Men, when they look at what do men on, this is dating sites, just pulling up their statistics. What age woman do they tend to find most attractive? 22. So whether the guy's 22 or 32 or 42 or 52 or 62, they tend to say 22-year-old women. So women have the most ability to attract a valuable partner when they're younger. Men, not so much. When they're 22, they're not seen by as many women as venerable, as maybe orderly and stable and productive. They're not earning as much. The guy's 22. He maybe just out of college. He doesn't have on-the-job training yet. So let's say you get two 24-year-olds who shack up, they get married, or they don't get married, they just start living together and having sex together. Um, and then they just stay together, but they're not getting married. What's happening? She starts with a higher sexual market value than him, but over time, her value is diminishing and his is growing. And he keeps saying, "Well, I don't know if I feel ready for marriage," and then keeps dragging off. Finally, this happens over and over and over again. 28, 29, and she's saying, here's another factor. Men can have babies a lot longer than women. Okay, it's not politically correct to talk about, it's reality. That a man can father a baby into his 60s and 70s even. Some data coming in that maybe the baby's more likely to have problems if it's a much older man, but he can still have a baby. He can still father a baby. Women, not nearly that old. And it's not a specific time. You know the exact age. You don't know exactly when it's going to be. Some women, it's when they're maybe 29, 30. Some women up into their 40s, but you don't know exactly. But there is a marked fall-off point where into their 30s, women's fertility starts to decrease. And so some women will be at the point that this just recently, who is that? Hermione Granger. Who played Hermione Granger? Who played Hermione Granger? What was her name? Yeah, Emma Watson was just talking about. She thinks society told her, "Oh, you need to get married and have babies." Why? Maybe it's society forcing that on her. I don't see that in our society, or maybe it's biology. I don't know. But for some women, they're around 29, 30, and they start saying, I might want to have a baby, and we need to go ahead and get married and have a baby." And the guy's, "I'm still not committed." He's now 30. He's still got plenty of time to have a baby, and he's much more productive. He's much more valuable in the market. So he can still play the field and sees no reason to commit. Now, if it breaks up and doesn't lead to marriage, now she is a 30-year-old, a 32-year-old competing with 24, 25-year-olds who have more youth and fertility, and it's not a level playing field. And she has invested her most attractive, like as able to attract a spouse, years to a guy who's not committed to her. And so that's the argument about why, that is one explanation about why shacking up tends to um, not lead to successful marriages. And some would also argue if they do get married, there is a sense that maybe they weren't committed before. Um, but it tends to be, this was supposed to be freeing women from oppression, but it seems statistically, it tends to be women who get the short stick. So what does this chart mean? The younger women are, and by the way, same. There's also an impact on men. Men are more likely to be depressed if they have sex outside of marriage, but it's just not as high. It's still pretty impressively high, but it's not nearly as high as it is for women. Women tend to be more impacted by this. Um, so what this is saying is the younger a woman is when she has her first um, when she has sex voluntarily the first time, how many partners she's likely to have in her lifetime, how many people she's likely to sleep with. 12 or younger end up with an average, so they're higher, of 21 different people that she has sex with. 26 or higher, 1.8. Okay. And again, when you connect that with the fact that we can tell the likelihood of success of your marriage based on the number of partners you have, you can see the impact this could have on real people's lives. And when you think of the messages we get from our culture with uh, even children being sexualized, again, I just ask. I'm not here to judge individuals. I'm here to ask really the people, the guardians of our culture, the people who tell us what to think. What are you thinking? Right? Are they thinking about these statistics when they're making the movies and the TVs and TV shows to tell us about how sex works and the impact on people's lives? Again, all throughout this, I'm asking, was the sexual revolution a net gain or a net loss? Percent of teenage women who are virgins. And when we consider the fact that sex before marriage is correlated with increased likelihood of depression. Okay, um, what this shows is the relationship between child's capacity to maintain sexual exclusivity for the future spouse, waiting until you get married, as old-fashioned as that sounds. Um, Although I think these charts are showing maybe it just sounds like common sense. Um, and the child's experience of care and belonging from the father. A girl's relationship with her dad has a huge impact on how likely she is to have sex before marriage. And this is not just a message to the girl. This is, I think, a message to men who so male students, if someday you're going to be a dad, be a good dad. Does this mean the dad has to be perfect? Nobody's perfect. And I think most kids understand that. No, it means care and show that you care. And this is how, remember, what is culture? Culture is our passing down to the next generation, what's important and how reality works. And we see this enacted here. I'll just let you read this one yourself. similar to an earlier one. So when you're 14 and then later, are you likely to have a child out of wedlock? Intact family, a third is likely for that to happen. Now, um, a lot of people say, well, it doesn't matter what you believe. Everybody, people are people, and it's not going to have any impact. That's just not true. Um, and there's a couple books I've mentioned about how religion actually makes a difference. Your faith makes a difference. Like Who Gives to Charity and Who Volunteers is a book, Who Really Cares, showing how there's unbelievably strong correlation between faith, people have believe in religion, and how they contribute to society. There's another very important book, More God, Less Crime, and another one, Christians Are Hate-Filled Hypocrites and Other Myths. All these talking about how faith really makes a difference. We're taught, oh, Christians, they just talk, oh, people shouldn't have sex, but they're doing it and they're doing all these things. If you have a pastor in an average TV sitcom or a movie, what's he likely to be like? Very often you see the pastor is sleeping around, he's been immoral, he just wants people's money. But the reality is, we can tell how likely you are to go to jail, to commit crime, to do drugs, to have sex outside of marriage, all these other statistics that make a difference to society based on how frequently you go to church or mosque or synagogue. Okay. And I gave a statistic a couple weeks ago. I got to pull that back up. That, what was it? Women who go to church weekly, I think, are like a fifth as likely to attempt suicide as those who don't. So why this is the case, we could contemplate why that was, because they feel like there's meaning in the world, there's somebody else beyond them, a higher authority. Regardless, notice what we tell by frequency of worship. People can just say, well, I'm a Christian, but does it make enough difference to you? Not that they sprinkle magic holy dust on you when you go to church, but is it important enough to you, your faith, that you will actually go to church weekly? Okay, and so um, here we see people who go to church frequently. It actually makes a difference on how likely they are to be virgins. 72% who go weekly or not versus 54% for those who never go. And again, that does make an impact on how many sex partners you have before you marry. Does have an impact on the likelihood of the success of your future marriage. It has an impact on depression, all sorts of other statistics. Similar chart here. Just let you read that one. Now here's one. We've heard this about, the people you hang around with are going to have a big impact on you. Sexual activity of teenagers by their peers, the people they hang around with. How often do their peers go to church or mosque or synagogue? Worships weekly. No friends are sexually active. 3% of them are sexually active. This idea that, well, everybody's doing it, not necessarily. Then those who don't go to worship at all, friends are sexually active, they're almost guaranteed to be sexually active. And again, when we think about the implications for that, especially for women, I'm not, by the way, not falling into the double standard. Some people say it's okay for boys, boys will be boys. That's not the way the Bible looks at it. According to the Bible, no one should have sex before they get married. It's for your own interest, but the Bible doesn't say it's okay for guys and it's not okay for girls. Okay, Paul was one of the earliest to apply that same standard for men and women. It was shocking at the time. We talked about a woman's right to her husband's body. Um, very egalitarian. But what we are admitting is it does seem to have different levels of impact on men and women. And again, it's not what women themselves say they want. Remember that one study I talked about where they said how many sex partners would you like in the next year, and men said, the average man said many, many. Hopefully those weren't Christians. And then women, how many sex partners did they say they wanted the next year? One. And then that one study they did when they had a very attractive woman go to men and said, "Would you like to have sex with me?" And a whole lot of the guys said yes. And they had a very attractive guy go up to women, and a whole lot fewer said yes. Very less likely. It's just women tend to want something different out of sex. It's not that it's not important to them, but studies have shown it tends to be they're more concerned with relationship. Okay, that one's similar to what we've looked at. Something nice to think about there. Good a good practice to be in when you have a family. Maybe think about having nightly devotions with your family. It doesn't have to be long. You just read a Bible verse, say a prayer, sing a hymn. Just 10 minutes. It's communicating to your kids how important that is to them, to you. Okay, so this, again, not all the founders were Christians, although I think many were than we often are told. But if we're going to get rid of or we're going to shrink government, we need other institutions to be encouraging order. We have ordered liberty. And what were those institutions? Two key institutions were family and church. And we see it's not just philosophizing, it's statistically the case. Family income by family structure and frequency of church attendance, much more likely to be well off financially, intact family, and weekly church attendance. Remember when I talked about that upward mobility in Utah, right? They emphasize, they're going to church, families are important, and they're more likely to be well off, be taken care of financially. The wealth gap, to a great extent, is the marriage gap plus the religion gap. Not saying that's all there is, but that's a lot of it. Showing how, thankfully, actually teen pregnancy has leveled off and slightly decreased lately. But we're seeing a lot more women in their 20s. It's becoming more prevalent, a lot more that um, women, especially among the underclass, are not getting married. It's becoming less prevalent. Very sad. Okay, in conclusion, reading some footnotes from this last one. In conclusion, these data suggest the intact married family that worships weekly or more is the greatest generator of social capital. What's that social capital? It's investing in kids, enabling them to succeed in the future and for them to be able to help the future society succeed. Intact married family that worships weekly or more is the greatest generator of social capital for the nation. It's in these families that children thrive most and through which the future nation is most fully developed. Is that the message that our intellectuals, that the media, that Hollywood are giving us? Um, Even though, again, a lot of these elites themselves are getting and staying married and actually going to church. The wealthy are more likely to go to church than the poor. That's not the marriage. That's not the message we're told. So, for a summary of the effects of radicalism, of the sexual revolution, and at a similar time in the 1960s, we also see not that everybody who's for the sexual revolution is for the drug culture, but for many it was, because the 60s was a time of challenging authority, and whether that's marriage or also the taboos against drugs. I think we couldn't find a better example than Timothy Leary. A group called the Moody Blues actually wrote a song about this guy. He was a professor. Where was he? MIT or something? Some elite college. He was a professor who suggested that we ought to. How did the saying go? Tune out, tune in. No, turn off, tune in, and drop out. turn on and tune in. Like you got to drop out of the rat race of society. You might have a point about that, but do some acid and see what the experience can give you a higher consciousness. Um, that for many went hand in hand with the sexual revolution. How did that all turn out? Tearing down our uh, previous norms. So I give in your packet a summary of the effects of the new left. What ended up becoming of Timothy Leary? Just a quote from a book on the radicals in America. His two children, with whom he had shared drugs um, and and drug busts in their teenage years, suffered the consequences. Um, and that just reminds me of this one story of a girl whose dad used to smoke pot with her. And people were like, "Oh, how cool! Must have been cool." And she said, "No, I hated him." Why? Because he wasn't doing his job. And a parent's job is not to be the kid's buddy, but to help them understand what's right and wrong and what will help you succeed in the future. And often that means telling you no. Anyway, Jack Leary, the son, who after a 1968 father-son drug bust, um, died before he got into trouble with the law, died before he could appear before a judge. Um, the insanity of Jack Leary, temporarily exhibited under the influence of hallucinogens, became a permanent fixture of his sister Susan Leary's sad life. After partaking in a steady diet of LSD and psilocybin in the 1960s, she spent the 1980s in and out of mental institutions. Um, her long, strange trip, which included beating her daughter into comas, defecating in laundromat washing machines, and shooting her boyfriend in the head, came to an end when she committed suicide. Um, they didn't tell you about this in sitcoms. Is everybody who sleeps around going to end like this? No, what I'm saying is when you tear down the fabric of society, there are effects. Some people, it hits harder than others, but throughout society, we see effects. They don't tell you they don't talk about the girl, and women are not just women, men get them too, but women are more likely to get STDs. They don't have that in pop music or romantic comedies or the woman who is wondering why the guy's not calling back. Okay, so they don't tell you that in about these problems that come with the sexual revolution. Although Downton Abbey does. So shout out for Downton Abbey. Um, Again, the key to ordered liberty is, can we restrain ourselves so we don't need the government to restrain us? And what are those key institutions that help us do that? Okay, that's enough for this time. The next lecture, we're going to look at a couple more statistics and decide um, are women better off or worse off? We're going to talk about what are some of the positives that have come about with women having more opportunities.